Hello, everyone. Hello. Good evening and warm welcome to all of you. I think it's very special for us to see a full house, coming for this special event, our annual Smith Memorial Lecture, and also the launch of the much-awaited book by Professor Paul Skelton on the freshwater fishes of Southern Africa. I'm particularly excited to see a good mix of the young, the middle-aged, and the not so young. So I just have a few house rules, so we'll request that you switch off your cell phones, please. And also, I just want to quickly thank DIFS, the HOD from DIFS and the DIFS family for sponsoring the drinks with a little bit of a percentage. So we thank you so much, Emma. So I'm going to ask Professor Alan Whitfield, the former chief scientist at SAIAB, to welcome and introduce Professor Skelton. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Albert. Good evening, everyone. It's a wonderful occasion. I'm not going to take up too much time because I think the floor really belongs to Paul this evening, but I do need to introduce him properly. Hopefully I'll give a few snippets that maybe many of you are unaware of about Paul. Most people know he grew up in Joburg, so he was but then he came to Rhodes University in the late 60s for his undergraduate studies. He majored in zoology and entomology, and then he went on to do honors in zoology. And after a little break, he registered for a master's on what he calls the rooivleertjies of the Southern Cape. At the Albany Museum, because it was at the Albany Museum when he actually took up his master's. He came under the influence of Rex Jubb, who had a big influence on his early years and his interests. But it didn't take long for Paul to actually start flying. And an indication of that is that his master's was actually upgraded to a PhD. So he never actually completed his master's. Instead, Rhodes actually upgraded it to a PhD in recognition of the standard of the work that he was doing. And he actually graduated as the first ichthyology student at Rhodes. So he registered via the institute. There was no DIFS in those days, and he became the first PhD at Rhodes University in ichthyology, which is a major achievement. Over the years, he's continued his close association with Rhodes and with the Eastern Cape, and I think we can regard him as an Eastern Cape boykie now because he's actually spent more than half a century in this part of the world. And in his latter years, he was actually awarded a Distinguished Old Rhodian Award by Rhodes for his contributions, not only to Rhodes, but in a much wider sense to the community. I met Paul in 1987 when I joined the Institute. Paul joined in 84. He had been the curator of lower vertebrates at the Albany Museum, and Professor Mike Bruton saw the value of having a freshwater curator of freshwater fishes in the Institute. As you know, J.L.B. Smith was into marine fish. He wasn't really concerned much with freshwater fish. And by appointing Paul, a balance was brought into the Institute in terms of taxonomy and systematics in terms of freshwater fishes. And it started off with him, and it's grown today to be a fairly major aspect of the Institute. In other words, there's a lovely balance between the marine and the estuarine components of the Institute, which is great. So in 1987, Paul took me under his wing almost immediately. We became very good friends. We played squash for the Rhodes University side, league side. We played social cricket together. We played some golf together, social. But something a lot of you probably don't know is that Paul was a very good horseman, or he played polocrosse. He even had his own pony, although it's probably more like a horse than a pony. I never ever, he must have got rid of this side of himself before I met him, because I never ever saw him play polocrosse or his horse. But over the years, Paul and I have grown close, and I rate him as one of my best friends. The other thing that in my second year here in 88, Paul invited myself and Nick James to join him on an expedition to Maputoland, and to specifically look at the Mkuzi River floodplain, where there are a lot of pans and things like that, where we were going to sample the freshwater fishes that had never been looked at before. And Paul was very into exploration. So he wasn't a taxonomist who sat in a lab and looked at fish from the collection. He wanted to go out into the field and explore all the time. And that was and in that field trip, I got a very good idea, or very good insight into Paul as an all-round scientist, not only in the laboratory, but in the field as well. Well-organized, dedicated, interested, not just in the taxonomy and systematics, but about the fish themselves. And that blossomed in latter years into conservation and the biodiversity of the African continent, particularly on the freshwater side, which is beyond just fish taxonomy. Now, Paul not only limited himself to this expedition to Maputoland, he'd already been up into Lesotho, or Basutoland, as I think it was probably called when he first went there, for the minnow that he was studying up as part of his PhD, linking up with the Fold Mountain Rooivalletjies. But he explored Southern Africa in the broader context. So he was involved in expeditions with Glenn Merrin, Mike Bruton, and others to Botswana, to Namibia, to Angola in his latter years, to Zambia, to Zimbabwe, to Malawi, to Tanzania. Paul has literally spread his wings over the Southern African continent, and that's why he can write an authoritative book like that today. The two countries I don't think he covered, and which were covered subsequently by Nick James and Albert Chikona, are Mozambique and Eswatini. I think Roger might actually be in Eswatini at the moment, because I saw him over the weekend filling up a SAIAB vehicle at the fuel station. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm off to Eswatini." But Paul was instrumental. If he hadn't become managing director of the Institute, he would have gone to those countries as well. But he had to limit his escapades to these various countries as a result of taking on the mantle of managing director of this institute. This happened in 1995. And I have insight into what happened in that period. This institute was teetering between provincialized, in other words, we would go to the Albany Museum, or the collection would go to the Albany Museum. Everybody else might have just lost their jobs. The other alternative was that the collection would go to Cape Town, to what was then called the South African Museum, because it was predominantly a marine collection at that stage. And again, the institute would have disappeared. So all of us, including myself, we owe our existence in this building to Paul, in my opinion, because it was that leadership and that engagement that he had with the people that count to ensure that this institute did flourish. And we should all be really, really grateful for what he did in those years. In addition to the fact that for more than 10 years, in fact, it was about 15 or 16 years, he wasn't able to apply himself to his freshwater fish studies the way he had planned to, okay? He initially didn't put his hat in the ring for this job, but he was persuaded by the board of the institute at that time that they regarded him as the candidate who could see SAIAB through this transition phase, and he did it with flying colors. Part of this expansion into other Southern African countries was accentuated by Paul's visits to museums around the world, because a lot of the fish species in Africa, the type specimens are often lodged in museums in Europe, UK, North America, not in Africa. And as a result of these expeditions, Paul set up contacts with these museums, African Museum in Tervuren, Berlin Museum, Paris Museum, British Museum in London, American Museum of Natural History. Paul spent time at these places as well, and he laid the groundwork for the leadership that Albert's taking now in terms of contacts with those museums. And also Albert has taken on that historical exploration beyond South Africa's borders, because fish don't obey borders. And it's wonderful that this institute, although it's called the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity, it's much bigger than that. It's a Southern African Institute of Aquatic Biodiversity. And I don't think we fully realize the level of our inputs into ichthyological sciences in the world. In comparison, we tend to look a little bit inward, and we don't see the world looking at us and saying, actually, those guys are doing some really, really good work. And Paul, on the freshwater side, is the person in the world who would be the first person to be contacted in terms of those skills. To give you an example, there was a PAFA, an organization called the Pan-African Fish and Fisheries Association, established, mainly West African initially, and Paul brought the whole PAFA to Grahamstown, or Makhanda now, in 1998 for the second conference. It was a big conference, huge conference, and it really put on the map, because people from around Africa were now seeing what we were. I'd like to finish off by just saying one of the awards that Paul got was actually for his first book, which had a similar title to this. It was also a field guide to the fishes of Southern Africa. It was the precursor to this book. So Paul, that was published, I think, in 1998. Paul had actually had it at a fairly advanced stage by the time he became director in 1995, but he saw it through to publication. And for that book, Paul was awarded the silver medal of the Southern African Society of Aquatic Scientists. Okay, so they award a silver medal, but they also award a gold medal. And about a decade or so ago, Paul was awarded the gold medal by the Society for his contributions to aquatic sciences in South Africa over his lifetime at that stage. And I don't think, I stand corrected, somebody might know differently, but I don't think anybody in South Africa or anywhere else has received both the silver medal and the gold medal, but Paul has. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Paul to tell us all about his new book.
That's the memorial lecture. Yes, like, I hope you guys don't come down to earth after those. Thank you very much. And I'd like to just start off by thanking people, thanking you for coming, thanking SAIAB and Albert for organizing this, and gee whiz, it's a big moment for me. People like Jean here, Judy, Bruce, a whole lot of you that I haven't seen or don't see regularly from the old days, the good old days. Times change. And it's just wonderful. It's quite an emotional moment for me to have all of you here. And I'll tell you now, some of you know Pedro. Pedro, are you there? Pedro's in New York City, and about an hour ago, he SMS means? Yes. You say he's going to watch this. So, hi, Pedro. Yeah, thank you very much. A lot of that was true. There were a couple of inaccurate measures. So the first book, as you were going to find out, was published in 1993, not 1998. But those are technical. I'm not going to worry about it. This is the Smith Memorial Lecture, and I'm very, very proud to give it. I'm very, very proud to come back here and do this because of all those things that Al mentioned. It was an emotional ride for me. It was an interesting ride. It was a wonderful ride. A dual career for sure. And people often say, you know, which was the better part? And I'll say they were both great because they both achieved certain things, and it was spelt out very nicely by Al. So thank you very much, Al, for all of that. So you got some background, and I'm going to give you a little bit more. Yeah, let's go back. Let's start. And let me just make sure I go in the right direction. Is it switched on? Ah, we've got people here. Just about, yeah, there we go. Okay. All right. That's it. Okay. So, anybody recognize the reflections? Come on.
Locals.
Are you locals or yokels? That's Blowcrunt's Pool. Isn't it beautiful? We'll come back to a little bit about Blowcrunt's Pool. But let's go on. It is a launch, and it is a fine moment because I've spent a couple of years, recent years, where I never had a boss except my wife, and she tends to leave me alone when I'm in my corner because then that means she can get on with doing whatever she wants to. And it's been a wonderful couple of years communicating. Modern technologies have allowed this to happen. You can work from home, you can have fun, you can have just a little nook, hey? You don't need big offices when you do this. And you can produce things like this with all the contacts and things that you have. So just to bring Alan into correction with J.L.B. Smith. J.L.B. was a smart guy, and he started his ichthyology in about 1928. Where? At the Albany Museum, people. He was then a chemist at Rhodes University, and he had this growing interest in ichthyology through his angling. And the very first fish that he formally described was a freshwater fish. There it is, 1936. He described a roiflackie. Yes, how's that, people? J.L.B. started his career, his first fish to be described, as far as I can work out, was a roiflackie that was taxonomists like Rex Jubb and people like that, and me, put it into synonymy with another species, so it wasn't out there. In this book, we've resurrected J.L.B. Smith and his roiflackie, because Albert did some wonderful work to show that J.L.B. Smith's species, in fact, is valid. So there it is. It was described as Barbus centiceps. It's now known as Pseudobarbus centiceps. And that was his first one. This was a publication of the Albany Museum, a first book, if you like, popular, of biodiversity in this part of the world, as reflected through the Albany Museum. A wonderful thing before the war. And J.L.B. wrote the fish. There it is, J.L.B. Freshwater fishes, 1936. So, you know, you guys get your priorities right. And the coelacanth came second. And in about 1973 or thereabouts, Jean, you can correct me, but this is what the Institute looked like. Those of you who've come on the campus in the last 20-odd years or so have no idea. So there's the lecture hall, there's the library, there was the road, there's the old zoology building, Phelps, I think, one of the girls' residents. Oh, we used to sit in that building doing our pracs. And the girls were just over there doing their thing. Our pracs were interesting to say the least. Anyway, that was the Tin and Iron. It was an old army building. Yes.
The Roads Department of Ichthyology in those days. It was
Yes, correct. Absolutely correct. But at this time, Roy, it was the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology.
No.
When it became in 1968, it transferred from being a department with J.L.B. to the institute under Margaret, and it was there. So I knew it as the institute. And I had my first lectures under Tom Fraser. It was a marvelous time, one-on-one. I sat on one side of the table, Tom sat on the other. How's this for privileged education? And Tom was an American. He's still around, and he's a prominent ichthyologist from Florida, thereabouts. And I sat on one side of his brown table, and he sat on the other. The collection room, there you go, was around us. And Tom, for the whole year, lectured me in ichthyology. And I wrote an exam. I passed, the best pass I've ever had. Why not? Because, you know. And that was the beginnings. A wonderful time there. And not long after that, in about 1975, 76, they got this building going, and everything moved down here. One of the people there, so I'm not the earliest here, was Jean. And Jean worked, and you'll remember that, Jean. And then Jean came here, and she stayed. She was there. She was JLB's secretary. There you go. And she ended up as my secretary when I first came on. So, Jean, it's a special, special moment to have you here. Just those are the So there you have it, people. SAIAB, as it's now known, and myself have been associated for over 50 years. It does date me, I know that, but it's also very special. It's also, you know, in a career, I feel very privileged for this reason, that when you start something and you can pursue that, and even in retirement, continue with the things that you started with. It's an incredible type of career. It has continuity in it like nothing else. So many people in this world start off in one thing, and their career takes them in all sorts of directions, and they don't end up doing what maybe their passion is. In my case, I started with Roy Flakies, and I'm going to show you I ended with, I'm still involved with Roy Flakies. But the J.L.B. Smith Institute, changing into the South African Institute for over 50 years, those two books there, I was the editor of the one in 96, where we celebrated 50 years from 1946 to 1996. And we had a transactions, so that's a lot of history. Jean was one of the authors in that, recording point-by-point history of the Institute, if you guys are interested. And then more recently, under Angus Patterson, he produced this 50 years, the director's cut. We invited all of the living directors then to record their moment in history. So it is recorded, and that's all I'm ever going to do with that type of history, I'm afraid. But I've got lots of other historical interests. But a big thank you to SAIAB for supporting me, for supporting this book. It's sponsored by them, generously sponsored by them, and that means it allowed it to be relatively affordable. And as modern books go, it's full of color, and the quality of the paper, the quality of the work means it's not a cheap book. It's not like a novel you go in there and you pay 300 Rand for because the paper is, you know, brown newspaper and so forth. And that's what they do with these modern, they pump them out. But that book is a quality product, and they are expensive to produce. So thanks very much to SAIAB for that generous, and the NRF NRF and SAIAB for generous sponsorship of the book and for supporting me over a lifetime. So, I've told you about J.L.B. Smith, but Grahamstown, how's this, people? You ain't seen nothing yet. So this guy, Andrew Smith, came to Grahamstown in 1820. Yes, 1820. And here's the best part of it. He started Freshwater Ichthyology in about 1823, 24. He was posted out to Fort Wilshire. Do you know where Fort Wilshire, all you historians are? Where's Fort Wilshire? Come on. There you go. Roy knows it. Roy's like ancient history himself. It's on the Kaiskama River. It's a ruin today. But at that time, it was the fort where the British part met the Xhosa part and traded. And it was an establishment there. And Andrew Smith was a medical doctor. He was the district medical surgeon here, and he was posted there for 6 months. And we never heard anything about it, except when he went back to London, he took some specimens with him. And he was posted to Fort Pitt at Clapham, outside on the Thames, just outside London, where he established a little museum and he had his specimens. That was 1837. He was the founder of the South African Museum, the first founder. He is the father of South African zoology. In 1829, thereabouts, 30, he established the first South African scientific journal. And in volume 5 of that, in 1831, he published fish distribution, including a genus and species, 2 species called Diacopoma. Diacopoma means that the gill covers are affected. And if you look at this specimen, you see the gill cover there is affected. And it was Diacopoma, typicoides, and typus. They were very clearly described. He was a clever man. And we know exactly what they were. It wasn't illustrated, but we know exactly what they were. The problem was the journal was so youthful and local that the people who counted in ichthyology overseas never came to recognize it. So in 1830, yes, Cuvier from Paris described a species, Spirobranchus capensis, from collections made near Cape Town, and that Spirobranchus happened to be the same as Diacopoma, but nobody knew Diacopoma existed, so it didn't feature. And Cuvier, of course, was in the heart of Paris, in the heart of things like the big museums and so forth, and so it became noted, okay? And this specimen, Andrew Smith made no mention of specimens. And I often wondered about this Diacopoma when I came across it. Anyway, in 1852, Andrew Smith became the Director General of the British Medical Corps. That, for all of us who know history so well, was when the Crimean War was in place. And the Crimean War is famed for a couple of things. One is the horrendous battles that took place between UK, the British forces, and the Russian forces and so forth. And they killed each other and did horrible things. And the reputation of the medical corps came under scrutiny of Florence Nightingale. Who's heard of Florence Nightingale? She was a tough cookie. And Andrew Smith was the director of the medical corps. So there was a royal battle between Florence and Andrew Smith. He only just assumed responsibility, so it wasn't his making that they didn't do so well. However, the ruckus in the British Parliament and everything else meant let's coin a local phrase, he was gutful. And in 1858, he retired, got out, And Florence Nightingale walked into Fort Pitt and said, "What's that collection? Get rid of it." So they got rid of it. The specimens went to where? The British Museum. Who was there? Albert Gunther. Albert Gunther took specimens from that Fort Pitt and described this one as a new species. Yes, Actinopoma, and he called it Microlepidotus. Actinopoma microlepidotus. Okay. Bullinger, the next great guy, comes along at the end of the century, goes through all of this. He's doing the catalogue of African freshwater fishes in the British Museum, and he looks at his predecessor, Albert Gunther's work, and says, not so good. That's clearly not Actinopoma multispiral. That is then known as Sandelia bainsii, and he puts it right. So that specimen was a holotype of a species. It had to have come. It was one of Andrew Smith's. It's the only one that I published this, there it is. The only one that I can trace that might be beautiful condition. Why was it in beautiful condition? He was a medical officer. He knew exactly how to preserve things. And he had all the resources at Fort Pitt, so he could do it. In those days, they used to go trekking in an ox wagon and cut them up and dry them like flowers. But not this. And it's there in the British Museum. So lovely stuff, and it's really good. Albert and I are doing a little thing. We're going to try and get DNA, because it was preserved in spirits. Get DNA and see if that providence question that I've just described to you is true or false. Time will tell. The other guy I want to just mention was Castelnau. Castelnau is better known for marine fishes. I'll grant that. But he did do some freshwater fish work. He was the French consul for 2 years in the 1850s, okay, down in Cape Town. He was, you know, David Livingstone discovered Lake Ngami for the Western science, not for the locals there. They all knew about this lake, but for Western people, Lake Ngami was discovered by David Livingstone in 1851, 52, about there. In 1856, 57, Castelnau sent guys up there to collect fishes. They made a beautiful collection, brought them back, and he described them in 1861, together with others that he had collected himself, including one from the Kauri River. They're the type specimens in the Paris Museum. He described the tiger fish in our waters. That's Castelnau from Lake Ngami, and so Lake Ngami read the Great Okabanga. And he did other things. Beautiful sketchbook has recently come up. His collections were lost for 100 years. They were rediscovered in Liège, a city on the Meuse. You all know the Meuse, don't you? Don't you? Who knows the Meuse? Not one hand. The Meuse was the frontier between Germany and the Allies in the First World War. It was a battle zone. That's where they, you know, very close to that part of the world. This collection was found in the Museum of the University of Liège a few years ago by one of the colleagues who comes here, and an Australian guy looking at Castelnau's collection. And I went down there, and that's what I see, the missing type of one of our iconic species there. But he did have our old familiar friend from the Kauri River, and he described it as Sandelia bainsii. I mention that because that's a bit of taxonomy for us. Sandelia, after the Xhosa chief who was leading the Xhosa tribes in the frontier war that in the 1850s and thereabouts, topical for them, for Castelnau when he visited Grahamstown, and bainsii after Andrew Geddes Baines, who was building Eka Pass and all of that at that period of time. Isn't that a beautiful name? Encapsulating the dynamics of people working in this area at the time. So very interesting, and so forth. Along comes Skelton in about 1972, and he's sent up to the Cat River. Cat River. Do you know where the Cat River is? Who knows where the Cat River is? Ah, we're getting there. We're getting there. Cat River, people. So I joined the Albany Museum, and Rex Jubb walks in the next day and said, "Paul, there's a fish kill in the Cat River. I said, huh? He says, yes, won't you go and see what's happening? Packed a bucky with a big gill net, and I've never seen a gill net in my life. And off I went to the Cat River, and I set this gill net. The thing that was dying was the mochel. Who knows the mochel? Ah, you know the mochel. Yes. We're getting there, people. Education happens slowly, but it does. So I went to investigate why mochel were dying in the Cat River. And I put the net in, and the first fish I caught in my career as an ichthyologist was a thing that I caught. A bass. A bass. Yeah, I thought it was a bass. I brought it back and then looked at things up in the book, and it was Sandinia Bay. So there you go. And in 1815, there was a beautiful sketch of the bass and the mochel done from the Kaiskama River by an ensign before Grahamstown even existed, people. This was a sketch that I found in the Africa Museum in Johannesburg. It's a beautiful sketch, but those two fishes featured by an ensign with the Cape Core, and they were camping out there in so forth. So that was my first fish, and kind of. All right, I'm going to take you on now. Otherwise, we're going to be here till midnight, or maybe the next century. And I just want to mention Keppel Barnard, because Keppel Barnard was in the 1930s, 1940s, the freshwater fish, a scientist in South Africa. He was part of the South African Museum then. They were establishing and building up nice collections. He was a brilliant scientist. He was a polymath. You name it, this guy was good. He was a mountaineer, and he produced 2 books. So that's the reason, I think, because we're talking about a book launch. He published this pictorial guide to South African fishes, a little book I bought for about 12 shillings or something at one stage. A lovely book, illustrated, but very out of modern context, not color, not all that sort of thing. But nonetheless, probably the first book on marine fishes, and that popularly available to people in this country, Keppel Barnard. And then his science was superb. His science was outstanding, and he published a revision of the freshwater fishes of the Southwest Cape area, and that for me was a go-to work when I started looking at kiliminkies and so on. And then Alan mentioned Rex and Hilda Jubb. They link back to the J.L.B. Smith because he was the first freshwater fish man to be employed by the then Department of Ichthyology at Rhodes University in the 1950s. About 1957, he was appointed there as a freshwater fish man. There was I think, a sort of clash of interest between the space available in that little cramped place for collections of freshwater fishes that were suddenly beginning to happen, and personalities. JLB was not the easiest. He didn't tolerate the distractions and things like that, and I think Jean will bear that out. And so Rex took the freshwater fishes and went to the Albany Museum and started the Albany Museum, where, by the way, JLB had been before the war. And then it burned down in 1941. And so the collections were brought to Rhodes University. And so, you know, there's a little bit of toing and froing about origins and all sorts of things like that. But Rex came and he took the collection there, and he published this book on what is today Zimbabwe and surroundings, the fishes. And he was a meteorologist who went out there, and a great naturalist. And this is a fine book. And I was reading his foreword and his notes, and it's amazing to read the purpose that he has. It's exactly the same purposes that I have in my book. Yeah. And when I read that, I thought, you know what? Some things don't change. The need to communicate, the need to take science and bring it into public knowledge, take it out of self, is critical for all of us in science. If you don't do that, your science becomes insular and forgotten. It's got to be put out there into public knowledge. If you don't do that, you're a failure as a scientist. And as what Coolhand Luke would say, a failure to communicate. All right. So Skelton comes along, and I started publishing, as Alan says. I started on Killiminky, and here it is, 50th anniversary in the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology, my first fish to be described. It was then described as Erebescens. This is what I started off. This was basically the masters that I started and so forth. And I tried to draw, not very well. We had Liz Tarr, who was a much better artist, but we started her with some freshwater fishes, and she got better and better and better. But this is 1974. 50 years ago, you youngsters. But I feel really good. How's that? It's the 50th anniversary to be able to stand here and talk to you like this, like a public politician. So 50 years of Roy Blackie. And so Roy Blackie, there's a Roy Blackie. Now you know why it's called a Roy Blackie, okay? And they occur, I'm not going to tell you too much, but it's a celebration for me of 50 years of Roy Blackie. For anybody to hold on to the beginnings of your career and still be tied to it at the end is remarkable, especially when they're Killiminkies or little Roy Blackie. Because you know, when we were students, and Wouter will remember this, Rick Winterbottom's designation for freshwater fishes, of which I was studying, the others were doing serious stuff, marine fishes, where they were just reptiles. That's what he called them. Remember that, but he didn't think it was much. But anyway, they were Roy Blackie. Okay, over the time, we found remarkable things about these Roy Blackies, including that they polyploid. That was Daksha. She came along, and we put her onto karyotypes and karyology. Oh, big words, eh? And we published that. We found that they had a doubling up of their chromosomes. That was remarkable. There's no other cyprinids, or we didn't know at that stage, but we found a group, and I'll show you the next line, how remarkable this is. A group of polyploid cyprinids. The rest, most cyprinids are diploid with about 50 chromosomes, but there are a number of groups, mainly in the high Himalayas and the big mountains of the world, where geology causes all sorts of things to happen when fish are breeding in the rivers, and it upsets their breeding cycles, and so the duplication of chromosomes happen. But here, Southern Africa, only ones in Africa, apart from Morocco, which are European. And then a postdoctorate, Steve Lowe. Some of you may remember Steve, a very, very nice guy, very interesting chap, a British fellow. He comes into my office one day and said, Paul, I was diving in the river and I heard this sound. And I'm almost sure it was some fishes. So I said to Steve, get back there and do a recording. He did. We published in 2008 the sounds made by Roy Blackies, the males when they set up a territory. And we recorded it, there's the recording, and we published that. It's the first and only recording of sounds being made by cyprinids in Africa. Nothing has come out before since. And I'm almost sure there's more that it goes through the group. This is just a start of something that is out there waiting for study. Okay? Okay, come to the modern day. Now, 2004. I'm working with a guy in Florida, a Chinese postdoc who is living in America, in Florida, and he's very smart. He's the world authority on working out how this polyploidy happens. And he published a big paper in about 4 years ago, explaining cyprinid polyploidy. And he noted that this one group came from a diploid lineage and suddenly had polyploids at the end of it down in southern Africa. And he contacted me. Li Yang is his name, by the way. And we've been working. He's doing the fancy work, and I'm just saying yes, 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 and so forth. But I put the local context on it, where they occur, and I made my mind go crazy about trying to explain the distributions of this. And I'll just show you how curiosity and science, sorry, I shouldn't be standing in front of this thing. Science, yes, works. So we found up there in the Lesotho Mountains a red fin, way back in 1973, 74, and the rest of the red fins are down here. And my big problem was, how do you link those over land? And remember, freshwater fishes don't just get out of the water and walk. They have to be connected by fresh water. They are ground to the planet, the earth, tighter than any other vertebrate, tighter by far, because they're tied to fresh water. And how do you explain that? I explained it one way, which was wrong. And we now are beginning to re-examine and try and find out how. And that's the quest. And it's really working out into fancy ways. And I just don't have time to tell you all those fancy ways right now. But that is ongoing right now. I'm still dealing with Kiliminkies and Roy Perky. Guys, that's real ichthyology. Hey? None of these big grunters and things like that. All right, okay, that's enough history, and that's all. I'm passionate about history, guys. I think it's because it was my best subject at school. And I had to do something in historical. All right, I'm going to spend the rest of this Smith Memorial telling you about this, the book and where it comes from and what it's about and so forth, just to give you an insight into, I think, the science, just what we know and how we express it in ways that I think the public can understand. So the first book was, there's a cover by Dave Voorveld, a former artist here. There's a picture hanging up, I think, outside the director's office, just to the left or somewhere down there. You'll see that picture painted by Dave Voorveld, 1993. Straight took over Southern Book Publishers and brought out their own edition because they'd run out of stock in 2001. And that was the cover, and most of you may have seen that or dealt with that. And then the third one, 23 years later, big gap. All right. So the first question you do when you publish a book, and the first question I had in 1993, where I had to convince the director that I was on track to do this work. And he said, why don't you produce a scientific? You're a scientist. And I said, Mike Bruton was his name at that time. And I said to Mike, Mike, yes, I can do a scientific and do all the synonyms and all of that and that. And you know what? That knowledge will reach 100 people, maybe 200 people. I said, if I do this book, it reaches 10,000 people. And I'd rather do that because I think too much of our science was just for a very narrow audience. It wasn't for the audience that we really should be working if we're in public institutions. It's very different if you're in a little private lab and you can do those things. But in a public institution, you have an obligation to the public, to the taxpayer who funds your salary. And that was why. So the target audience for the book, people, is necessarily broad. It addresses everything. You won't find references in brackets to some author, not one, deliberately. It doesn't mean a thing to the audience that we're trying to address. What does mean a thing is that it's good science and it's good work and it's well written and so forth. So those are the things. So it's necessarily broad, from the curious, those who just want to know, to the seriously concerned, to the students and other workers who want the latest names and so forth. I've pitched it as wide as that. It's comprehensive introduction. Why? If you go to the bird books of the day, or even the plant books or something like that, you often just get an identification guide. They have 3 pages of introduction, telling you how to use this book and so forth. And then you go straight into descriptions of birds and things like that without any explanation about the life of birds, what influences birds, all that sort of thing. There's nothing else available on fishes. So there's an extensive introduction and background. That's the reason for it. And then every species, and we tie the species and its illustration and its maps into an account. Why? Because I get annoyed when I get to a book and it says, see plate 5. And I'm reading this and I've got plate 5. Have you ever had that frustration? You can't, oh yeah. But plate 6 is the other one. So I said, no, everything in a package, okay? And then it's well illustrated. Why? Because I'm talking aquatic world to the public. How do you bring across a completely different world to the way we live? And I did this in the formal launch, or the launch that I went out at Harris Porter, to say, talking fishes in a botanical garden is like talking fishes in the Kruger Park. How many of you go to the Kruger Park and say, did you see the hilly minky in the pan? None. You say, oh, that with a big Prada line. Did you see that male grunt? And, oh, did you see the aardvark and the porcupine and everything else? Because we can see them and we're familiar with them. But the fishes, how many of you look over a river in the Kruger Park and say, oh, look at that? Yeah. Fantastic, I do too. So my next slide was actually a picture over the Williput River, and there was a nest with tilapia breeding, and there's a male. You can tell it's a male. Wow, black and white and all of that. And I say, there's a highlight of my Kruger Park visit. Okay, all right. So photographs try to bring the people into the aquatic world, and it's very, very profusely illustrated. So the features of the new edition: a completely rescripted introduction, revised and updated species list, photos, diagrams, etc., and up-to-date science. And people, it's been an absolute pleasure for me to catch up again in the last now 12, 13 years since I retired with my science. And I just love it. I can do it easily. I've got Muddy in the library here, and she is a gem. People, if you haven't ever come across Muddy in the library, she's first class. And she provides me with anything I want. So it's really wonderful. There's a sort of photographs that I've been access to. There's some guys out there that are just passionate about getting into clear, fresh waters and taking beautiful pictures. And there's one in particular, Jeremy Shelton, but there are others, Craig Garrow's his name, and people like that. They produce beautiful pictures. So I've tried to use as many of those just to bring the beauty of freshwater fishes and their dynamic environments, flowing waters, unit-flowing waters, rock pools, all sorts of things like that into common knowledge. So that's the purpose of it. And I've had a lot of people. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are a whole lot of names. Some of them you'll remember or know personally as ex-students and things like that, who've been very generous. Whenever I've said, have you got a photograph of? Oh no, yeah, but ask so-and-so. And I'd ask so-and-so, yes, and it'll come. And so the book's a tribute to them. I'll give a very brief, I think, and rich history, because I could write a book on the history. And that's a very nice part of it. I won't go into that, otherwise we'll get stuck here forever. The geography, why? Because the aquatic world is somewhat affected by the linkages of rivers and things like that. If you don't understand that, you can't see the significance of, say, the Kalahari Desert or the Lesotho Highlands. What are they in terms of the landscape and in terms of fish life and so forth? So we've gone extensively into the geophysical features and the climate, and some beautiful maps produced by people and so forth. I've revised. Yes, I was very instrumental in determining the aquatic ecoregions, and my knowledge of Angola has expanded considerably in recent years. And I decided to tinker with the aquatic ecoregions and make them more accurate and so forth. And we've got that so people can understand where faunal similarities are predominant in the situation. And then maps. There are plenty of maps. Why? Because you need to know. If you're in Europe and you get this book and you want to know, oh, where does that occur? If you haven't got a map in front of you, local geography means nothing. So this book is aimed at from top to bottom, and maps are critical for that explanation. John Mendelsohn, he was the former director of the Durban Natural History Museum, of the Windhoek Museum, and a superb cartographer. He lives in Windhoek and he volunteered. He said, Paul, what do you want to do? Only one condition. Shame. I had to go to him just on a reserve. He was then director of a research institute south of Etosha, and spend a week with him. Oh, it's hard, eh? Willem Kutzer here was a magnificent information specialist, and he produced a lot of the species maps. And then Nick Rivers-Moore, some of you will know Nick. He's a modeler, and he did some really interesting ones on effective temperature. Another scientific thing which I'd love to tell you about, but I can't. Fish anatomy, we redid and refreshed all of those infographics. Some of you are into infographics and you'll recognize how we've made them come to life. Life cycles, again, infographics. We brought a couple of new ones. We revised the old ones. We put the eels into context for one of the first time. One of the big questions I often come across when I'm out there and people say, oh, freshwater fish, oh, you know, the eels, and how did they come? And I've got an eel on the beach, or whatever it was. And you try and explain it. So I try to put the currents and the local currents and to bring it into a much more understandable life cycle and so forth. And then killimantes, yes, and the life cycle of an annual killifish over there. But then some of the more interesting diversions. That one there, the life cycle of African pike, that was Glenn Merrin's work. Glenn Merrin and Mike Bruton and Kathy Holden published that. And I thought that would be interesting. Why? Because you've got two top predators behaving superbly, looking after their young, nesting and guarding their young like lions. Hey, how's that? They don't just gobble up everything. They gobble up everything that wants to gobble up their young. It's fantastic. And then the life cycle of the Clan William Sorpin, just to say that killimankees are one thing, but these big river fishes need to move. They use different parts of the river in their life cycle, things like that. So I wanted to bring those elements into the thing. And then the age-old question of how old fishes live and so forth. I couldn't illustrate that it's not quite a book that gives you space to do that sort of thing, but I showed them how scientists use scales or opercular bones or otoliths to age fish, just like they do trees and things that have growth rings and things like that. And then in the little account, guys, this fella, my own aquarium fish. In 1992, I picked up a Cynodontus, squeakers for those who don't know, in the Okavango River. Tiny little chap, yeah. And I brought him back, put him into an aquarium. 1992. He died last year. He only grew that size. If you talk to people about clarias or the big tiger fish or something like that and say, how old do they grow? At a stretch, you'll get 12 years out of them. The eels maybe 15 to 20. But a squeaker, 30 years? Come on, he's older than some of you in the audience. Marvelous, eh? Yeah, unreal. Anyway, that's how little we know. There's so much we still have to know. Size classes, again, the question you always get from the public. How big, which is the biggest fish? In fact, I did a an interview with a YouTube guy today. It's going to be on, so you guys who follow YouTube, I don't even know what YouTube is, but I'll tell you. And one of the questions he says, but which is the biggest fish in the area? I said, oh, well, that's easy. I said, you go to the Bundu. Albert, you know the Bundu, hey? Yeah. And I said, and I told him about the Bundu and things like that, because they get quite big. But size is always, size counts, doesn't it? And there is a nice graph showing that it's not just a single or a diminutive, with smallest being the most numerous. In fact, there are two peaks. Some about that size is a peak, and then about that size. And then some very large ones and some really small ones as well. And then behavior, we try to illustrate that, but that means you need videos and you need all sorts of things to really illustrate it. But look at the fine picture of a 2 tilapia sparmani guard in their nest. This is again Jem Shelton, the same guy who took the cover there. His photography is just outstanding. Migrations, we talk about it. I've already mentioned the eel, but we try to do that to put local migrations. Fish move in rivers. They don't always stay put. Maybe a kiliminki or two will just stay in a pool and so forth. But things like tiger fish don't stay put. They come and go, and weirs and barriers and all those things are big, important things for the life cycle. And that's from a paper recently published that determined from radio tracking and those sort of sciences, the actual territory or life space, home range of the tiger fish in the Nkomati River. And I thought, well, let me illustrate it with a real example to just show that they are not stuck in one place, but they're not necessarily going to move over the whole river, not all of them. Okay. No. And then diadramy, to just put a little bit of knowledge into the parasites and diseases, a lovely topic. And this I approached my friend Nico Smith, Professor Nico Smith from the University of Northwest. And Nico said to me, Paul, you want some pictures of parasites? Yeah, sure. But I'll do you the infographics. I said, Nico, that's even better. And he produced some infographics here, which are blown up, just to show you what he's produced. How marvelous is this? There he says, there, take a tilapia sparmani, look inside its eye, that's what you're going to see. There's a parasite, and there's what it looks like in magnify. And Nico produced that just like that within a week or 2 weeks and sent them to me, and they're there. It's one of the reasons we're going on the road show next week. Monday, we're at the University of Northwest, where I can thank Nico and his students. And they partners with SAIAB. They're part of this platform. They've used actively. They come down here. They're looking after some of our collections and so forth. So it's really a lovely little bit of interaction for me and in the book and so forth. Nico Smith, by the way, his son, just for those of you who are not scientifically orientated, is an outstanding musician, making waves big time on the classical music scene. So very interesting there. Human interactions are always important, and always in a natural history book, we need to bring that into it to complete the cycle of things. And there are a couple of pictures you won't see in the book, but they're taken from my own field work over time. And what strikes me about encountering people, and the last time I did this was 2 months ago. We went to celebrate my wife's 70th anniversary at the Victoria Falls. My son generously took us there. And I went to on the Zambian side, and I was looking at the falls. It was very low, very dry. It wasn't quite as dry as it is now. But there was a guy with a net in one hand and a rod in the other. And he was beating the water here and catching fish. Right at the top, right at the lip of the pool. He came out, and I went up and said, can I see what you're catching? And had a chat. He was perfectly fluent in English and so forth, and we had a lovely chat and so forth. But what I'm really trying to say to you is when you're out there in the rural areas in tropical Africa, more particularly than temperate South Africa, but in tropical Africa, freshwater fish are a vital resource. They're not a luxury. They are a vital resource to those women and children who are, you can call them poor, but they're rich in every way of being human beings and so forth. And there is a picture of a boiling pot, tomatoes in it, and chilimenkis. Yes, they will take anything, and that becomes the protein source for their families and so on. Look at these guys here. That one there, I'll tell you there, look at him. I was trying to catch with an electrofisher in a rapid that's on the upper Cubango in Angola. And I was busy with Ben van der Waal trying to catch some fish. And this guy there with a stocky, an old bamboo with about 2 or 3 meters of line and a hook. And look at him. He knew exactly how to do it. And big smiling face and gave it. He was out there working for his food for his table, for his people. And so with these other ones, also those are both Angolan pictures where poverty reigns, rural poverty is extreme, and fish are a livelihood. And then, of course, some of the more classic, this is one of Glenn Merron's photographs of fish drives, cultural interactions with natural history up in Maputo land and so forth. You don't see that very often to that extent anymore, but the cultural side of fishing and fish life is very, very rich and very important for people. And then, of course, it goes way beyond just rural people. We talk about anglers, fly fishermen, Francois, Jacobs, he's the fisheries officer. Look at that. He knows how to catch a tiger fish. And I said to Francois, you're going to be the angler in my book. Here he is. Public displays and education, such as the Two Oceans Aquarium, and that in Cape Town. These are important. This is where people flock to just get insight into the aquatic world and so forth. Koi, now diving in fresh waters and so forth. There are a whole range of interaction taking place more and more with technology and fancy cameras, underwater cameras and things like that. So people and fish are very important. And I could go further into the angling side and so forth. I'm not going to at this moment in time, but I am going to talk about, to end off more or less, conservation and threatened species. People, the way human beings, us people, treat our rivers. Just when you've got a moment, take a walk down here to the Cowie Ditch and take a sniff. Okay? That's how we look after our treatment in some of the most educated corners of the land. There's some pictures. I went now. I've got a son and daughter in Irene in Pretoria, and they went to play paddle. Who knows what the game paddle is? It hasn't even reached the frontier. Oh, there are a few people who know that. Yeah. So they took me to Irene Country Club. Nogal, eh? Had to buy a jacket. No. But they took me there and they started hitting this ball like we used to hit squash balls. It's the latest and the greatest thing. Anyway, they were busy with that, and I said, I'm just going to take a walk down to the river. Henops River in an upmarket state. There, that's what I saw. That's a few months ago, people. That's the Henops River. Look at it. Disgusting. It's not an exception. Go to any of our urban areas, any one you like, and I'll guarantee you the rivers look like this. This is our fresh water. Fresh water is more precious than gold. Even if you just take it as a resource to be exploited, never mind a medium for fish and other life. Yes, it's a medium for fish and other life, if they can survive. But it's a vital resource for humanity and our survival. Ask Cape Townians. Ask Gautengers today. What is their biggest thing? It's not load shedding. It's fresh water in their taps. I'm not joking, people. That's the state of Africa and what it is. And it's all over. So we've got to get right. And I thought I'd just, those pictures aren't there. It was too late for the deadlines had been drawn, but I wish I could have put them in because I love that story. You might not like it. Taxonomy, I had to tell people why names change, because as a taxonomist, it's what everybody tackles me. Why did you change the name of that? We can't pronounce that name. Shame. Yeah, that's true. Very true. So we try and explain in this book because it's also a student book. Many professors use this. They've got nothing else to bring the aquatic life and ichthyology and fishes into their curriculum. So it's a book for that purpose as well. And that's why we put things like taxonomy and how the name was changed. And I'm using an example from my own experience there and there, and then just a couple of measurements just to show them that scientists do these funny things. Oh, name changes. Now, who's the anglers out there? Come on. A couple of strong anglers there. Only 2 of you. Noit. I don't believe you. If Olaf was here, I'm telling you, his hand would be up there first because he was the biggest bass angler in the country. So bass, just this last year, the name changed. So we all know largemouth bass, don't we? Micropterus salmoides. Okay, Florida bass, Micropterus salmoides. Largemouth bass, Micropterus nigricans. That's published in the last year or so by serious American scientists. What they discovered was if you look at the distribution of largemouth bass in North America, that's in blue there. Now they recognize Florida bass as a distinct species. That's down there. Those statices there are the type localities, okay, where these guys 200 years ago described them from. Unfortunately, the black star is Florida bass salmoides. For most of the time, that was one species. When they split it up, you've got to go with the type locality and the type specimen. So unfortunately, the name largemouth bass goes with Florida bass, not Floridanus anymore, salmoides. Imagine the confusion there's going to be when the guys pick up this book. I can't wait. I'm going to tell the anglers at Loskop Dam in a week's time, I'm going to have a lot of fun with them. And they're going to be, your bushjong. All right, so us scientists are aware of relationship diagrams. I've put them in because that explains a lot of the decisions around order, where we put the things, who relates to who, all that type of thing. If we're going to bring science to the public, we better do it, not hold back. They don't like it. More and more people, you need it if you're an educator, you need it if you're trying to understand why decisions and why things are like that. So the first one we put in there was this one here. I'm just trying to not push the wrong button. This one here, which is an interesting one. It shows the three main evolutionary lineages: Chondrichthyans, Sarcopterygians, and Teleosts. Anybody want to dispute that? We can have a real good debate. Anyway, let's just assume it's right. This one, of course, are lungfish and coelacanths and things like that. Oh, and all other tetrapods. Frogs, snakes, birds, cows, oh, and human beings. yeah, human beings. Okay, so what is a fish? Come on, you all know what is a fish. It's a scaly thing with fins, lives in the water. Yes, am I right? There's a clever professor there nodding his head. Of course it's not. If I published, as I did show you in 1974, I would publish description of Pisces. That was the class of fishes. Yes. If I submitted that paper to an editor today, I would be rejected outright from the title, nothing else. There's no such thing as Pisces in science. There's no class Pisces, fish. Why? for simple reasons, the way we work this. If sharks and bony fishes are fishes, and these guys and birds and everything, if that's fishes, then we are fishes. Back to roots, guys. We are fishes. That's an ichthyological perspective, isn't it? No, but seriously, so there's no longer a class in science called fishes. There is, of course, if you said to the popular public, what is a fish? And they say, a shark is a fish, yes. A whale shark is a fish, yes. Oh, and a killimink is a fish, yes. And a lungfish is a fish, and a coelacanth is a fish. Yes, you can talk like that, but not to a scientist. Scientist doesn't allow that. So you get bony fishes and all sorts of names attached to that, sharks and all sorts of names to that. And so the lungfish and the coelacanth are more closely related to human beings than are bony fishes and sharks and things like that. That's why it is like it is. Species accounts, just a quick one. There's what it looks like. There's one big family there, cyprinids. Most of our fishes are cyprinids, but also cichlids and a few little skyscrapers. Most of them are very small families, but fairly distributed wide. And a nice family diagram to explain the changes of order. So with the relationship changes, as we've got to smart and understood which fish belongs where, we have got a cladogram or a relationship diagram, and that's the order that you'll find them in the book. Not necessarily the order it was, and it changes. That's why. There's reason. Lots of new images, and you will see some, most of the new ones are photographs. I use photographs wherever I could. Why? Because digital imagery is now, everybody can take good pictures, and they are just as good as illustrations. They show scales, they show features, all that type of thing, if the photograph is good. There are a couple of cases where I had Elaine back in the days when I was still director. She did a few new species that were coming through, and I said, Elaine, please do illustrations. We are going to do the book one day, and let's do it while you're still here, and so forth. Taryn, there's Taryn there. She bent her little eye and did a species for me. Thank you very much, and very good. So that's in the book. So that's one of you guys contributed to. I had another student that I met a year or two back, and he was doodling while everybody was giving their lectures, including me. And I looked at his doodles and I said, hey, this boy can draw. Maybe I should give him a break. I did give him a break. He produced one. It took too long and he was too expensive, so he only featured that one. I had to buy his drawings. He cut his nose off to spite his face. And so unfortunately, Shaquille, his name only has the one. And then Val Myberg, she was the artist that was brought on board by Strake to do some of the illustrations in that. And we got down to a few where I just couldn't get a decent illustration. All I had was an original black and white sketch in a paper and nothing else. So this is Notobranchius imcusiensis by Fowler in 1933-34, thereabouts. That's only, no specimens have come to light. I had to imagine the coloration. Nearest species, I used Notobranchius pinari. I said to Val, just put some color. It does not matter. What does matter is that it's in the book. So that somebody said, oh, what am I finding here? And they can trace it back. And just maybe we'll find another specimen, or it's in a pan or something. Just maybe. Otherwise, it's extinct. And it might be extinct. It hasn't been collected for nearly 100 years. And then this one is a new one in which there are technical differences between it and its similar cogenitors. And we just never had a decent picture of that one. Minutus, I think it is, of it. So I had Val, and she was superb. I gave her these pictures. I said, color it up. one or two corrections to make, and so they're there and they're lovely and they're part of this work. Just to give you some background of how technical you get. Every single picture in that book had to be considered and dealt with on that basis. Full of weird and wonderful diversity. Even the marine fish guys will appreciate that. What's the rarest? Well, I've already mentioned the one. Some of our freshwater fish are only known from very few localities or one single locality. The cave catfish, it's known of probably less than 200 individuals. One cave in Namibia. We know that from Francois Jacob's work. Dived in it, they did counts, they looked in all the caverns and everything. We've got that work, wonderful work. That's one of his photographs of the cave catfish in the cave. So how fragile is that? That water is in a dry land. The water is pumped out and the level of the cave water has dropped 20 or 30 meters. These guys feed on bat feces, the odd baboon or kudu that falls into the cave, if they're lucky, and it falls onto a shelf because the cave's deep and so forth. How fragile is that for a really unique and known species? This little guy here, it's called Paramore Myrops jacksoni. I think it may be named after Peter Jackson. I think so. Not 100% sure. It was named by Max Pohl in the 1960s, about 1967, thereabouts. It was from the tributary of the Zambezi in Angola. And we had it in the first book as the ghost stonebreaker, stone bash. And I put it in there because it was available. Well, we're looking for it. We've had quite a lot of expeditions and collections from Angola over the last 20 years. Nothing. About 6 months ago, there's a guy doing an expedition down a river, Kwando, which joins the Zambezi above the Victoria, down in Zambia. And he sent me photographs. He said, Paul, what are these fish? You know, Kilimenke, Sherpa, all that. Came across this one. My colleagues had said to me, Paul, that's just a starved other type of more mirrored. And I said, no. I said, I'm leaving it in that book because it looks different to me. There's something about it. There he is. Look at that. So he got 4 specimens from a second locality. How rare is that? Eh? And then, of course, this little guy, he was known from one tiny tributary coming into the Barotse floodplain near Mongu. And when I say tiny, well used, trampled by the cows, pumped out for everything else, and it survives there. And again, we looked, no record. Suddenly, one of those expeditions going down there, Ben van der Waal comes, and Ben knows his fish quite well, and he was able to get a second population also coming into that. So there are some very rare ones, and I can go on with other ones like that. So I don't know if there's a rarest, but there's some pretty uncommon species out there. How many? Look at the records. 1993, 222, 2001, 228, 324, 315. This time, I sort of estimated that we were just about there, 95% we have known. How wrong could I be? Look at that. Why has that happened? Well, there are the areas of growth in the book and so forth. We won't go into that in too much detail. But I'll just go very briefly, because this reflects what's happening out there in science today. So discovery. Yes, we are getting to a few new places, and you're finding these species and so forth. But innovative, philosophical, and technical advances. Philosophical, how we classify organisms. Not just on similarity, but on graded similarity. Very distinct type of similarity. Got to be derived characters and so forth. Phylogenetics. Electrogeneration. So Bernd Kramer from Regensburg, a good old friend who's been here a couple of times, and Albert's taken up a lot of that work. These fish talk like pigeons or budgies, okay? And they help us to understand the differences between populations and so on. And then, of course, what Gwyneth is so good at, DNA analysis, and there's a picture of Gwyneth in the book, just by the way, for those who don't know. And then here's the best part. New generation of emerging scientists, human capital growth. This is what SAIAB is all about. This is what about a national facility coupled with a university teaching ichthyology is all about. A new generation of really good, serious scientists is making their mark. They're publishing. Albert is my grand student. Ernst Swartz was his supervisor, and Ernst was my student. So he's my grand student, and he's making a mark. And it's really lovely to see these new generations of excellent scientists coming through. And then science investment, something like SAIAB. You can say what you like, people, but SAIAB was a tiny institute with about a dozen people employed when I started. Today, look at it. Buildings, vehicle fleets, platforms, they're doing oceanographic stuff. They've got a boat in Durban. They've got a boat in Port Elizabeth. These boats allow oceanographers and serious scientists to do work they couldn't otherwise do in the past. They had to wait for sea fisheries to send a big ship up the coast in order to do a once in a 5-year type of cruise thing. Now they can plan their research and do it with modern equipment through SAIAB and its associated and collaborative things. People, that's why our ichthyology is flourishing. For those reasons, and we should not forget it, this is a special place, and it's a special place because it's a hub for development in that. And I can name other people and things like that that have done that. But I really feel the way I've witnessed SAIAB come on since it became a national facility, what a find it is really. And now just keep it going. That's all. Okay, here's an example of how phylogenetics adds species. So this is Albert's work, and his supervisor, Ernst Swartz. Sorry, I'm moving away from this camera. I'm not a film star yet, eh? Yeah, okay. So there he did some rooivlekkies. Yeah, he looked at, there they are, rooivlekkies. And he determined a bit differently to what I did, that there were two branches of rooivlekkie. Those with one barbel and those with two barbels. And amongst them, there's a name that I use, but look at that, 3 or 4 species. A couple of species there, an oddball over there, and a couple of others here and so forth. So that type of work, we are digging deeper. We're getting better at science. We're using modern techniques because we've got them available through an institution like this. And that's why there's an explosion of understanding of our science and so forth. Electrophysiology, I mentioned it. There's just a depiction of what has happened. In the past, we could not distinguish on morphological grounds between groups like those 3 there. But when you start looking at the way they chirp and behave and all that sort of thing, you start realizing there's not one, there's 3 species. So we get in a profusion of, and one of those skyscraper ones with the more mirrors that went from about 7 or 8 to about 20 odd species in the last 20 years. Not just because we're applying good science to these sort of things. And then, of course, I feature also the aliens. They're part and parcel of it, whether we like them or not. We need to have them out there. We need to have people knowing that they're there, knowing how to identify them and all that sort of thing. So our alien fishes are highlighted in a neutral way. This book does not seek to position itself in regard to these things. There are positions, and we can have big fights if we want to, but this is a book for all the people out there who wants to know what the fishes are. So what do we know about freshwater fishes? Buy a book. Tries to answer that question, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We're going to throw the questions open to the floor here first before we go online and take questions from the online audience. So if anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask of Paul or comments, please go ahead.
I've told them everything.
Yes, you've done. Well, I've got one question.
Oh,
To what extent are estuarine fishes covered by the book in terms of how they use freshwater systems?
yeah. I knew that one was coming. Oh, this is the freshwater fish book. It's more how freshwater fishes use estuaries than estuarine fishes use freshwater. But no, we have a section at the right at the back. Ours published a book that thick, that big on estuarine fishes. I wasn't going to compete with Alan, but he's actually correct. If you go to some of our freshwaters, you're going to find a fish that you'd most normally find in the estuary. And so I just pick on the more common ones that you might encounter. I haven't tried to do any more than represent them accurately from their scientific perspective. And we've done that, I think, quite well. There are some very interesting estuarine, yes, there are some interesting ones. And so we do handle it, and it is there insofar as those guys come into the freshwater. And I say, let me just divert very quickly. So I'm interested in a place called Gona Resort. Hey, Albert, Gona Resort.
Yes.
Gona Resort. Which is southeast Zimbabwe. And I'm reading this book. And Frank Jr. and people like that at the Sabi Runde confluence, they would collect things like sawfish. How's that? Right inland into Zimbabwe waters, you collect. And sawfish are perhaps one of the most threatened of groups in the world. And I remember an iconic big saw in the Institute. Remember that, Jean? In our collection room, there was one. And he didn't think very much of it. And I think in St. Lucia and some of the bigger rivers, they used to be fairly common. But gill netting and things like that. And we haven't had a record of sawfish in freshwaters, at least during my career, 50 years at least. So I mention that because they are also highly threatened and endangered and things like that.
Thanks, Paul. Yes.
Over.
Yes, Paul, maybe quickly, you can just tell us what are and where are the blind spots in the knowledge of freshwater fish?
Where were the blind
The blind spots, yeah.
You mean what have I left out?
What needs to be done?
Thanks, Oprah. Now, what needs to be done and that sort of thing? I think we're on track. I think the modern generation is on track in terms of both exploration, finding what's out there, and then having a resource base like our collection, which is coupled to proper tissue banks and things like that. And so the scientific side of things is going along very well. Where we're missing is perhaps in the sort of science that I say is deep ichthyology. My science. Yeah, I say that with all humility. If you're interested in fishes, you're interested in not just what a new species is and so forth. You're interested in their history, in how they evolved, in how they got to where they are, why they are rare, why they're not, and all those sorts of questions. What I would say is the big gaps is most of our students and younger generation do a PhD study, which can go so far in 3 or 4 years. But the deeper questions, and this is my experience as a retired ichthyologist, people, there's nothing like a time when nobody tells you when to clean your dishes or eat your meals or whatever it is, where you're allowed to sit and think things out and analyze problems and really work on them. Sometimes with frustration that you can't solve it. But that type of time comes, it's with a PhD. PhDs are your most intense period. I think most of those with a PhD will say that they've never worked more intensely with their brain trying to solving problems. But once that's achieved, they move into short-term problems, EIAs or whatever it is, and a small taxonomic issue and so forth. And the freedom of scientists in public institutions, in universities and so forth, is publish, perish, and so forth. Sometimes proper science requires deep thought and a lot more than just publish or perish. And that's my experience. And I think if there's a gap, to me, Africa lacks those scientists capable of doing that. They even in the big museums and things like that of Europe, the pressures are enormous on the modern world, where the world is changing so rapidly, to discover and put out and talk conservation and things like that. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it shouldn't be museum scientists to do that, and unfortunately it is. So deep science has been my answer to that one.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, Judy.
So, Paul, you've got enormous experience, and there are lots of young scientists in the room now. What would be your one message to those young scientists starting their careers or in their early careers? What would be the most important lesson you've learned in 50+ years?
Hang in there. Tenacity is my father. Yes, people. When I graduated, he came to my graduation. He was an industrialist. He was in Shell Oil Company, yes. And he sent me to university to get a real job. Little did he know I ended up in a museum, which was not his idea of a real job. And he asked me, he said to me, well done, my boy, congratulations, all that sort of thing. Now, when are you going to get a real job? And if you look at systematics and people who do that, the number of jobs you can count on your one hand in a discipline. Take our museums in this country. You tell me how many ichthyologists are employed as ichthyologists. How many? I was employed there. I was the only ichthyologist practicing in a museum, apart from Butch Halley in the South African Museum at that time. There were 2 or 3, and in the most diverse vertebrate group on the planet, because they were out of sight and out of mind, or industry happened to be fisheries and things like that. It was not just the curiosity of good science. And so the problem with our situation is a simple one. There are no posts available where you can say, just go and do ichthyology. All you're going to do is study fishes and publish on fishes. And even with Albert, we get postdocs, they come for 3 years, and then they've got to find another postdoc, and off they go. And positions for good scientists to do science is very, very rare. It's not a reality. And I'll give you another example. My son, my youngest son, he's a very clever scientist. And I'm proud of it, and I'm not stretching the imagination. Yeah, he was a botanical PhD gold medalist. He's a P-rated scientist. He traveled to Berkeley on headhunting in Berkeley, etc. Okay, I'm bragging. He went to his alma mater and he couldn't get a job. Wits University recognized him and created a post for him. His first job was a professor, not junior lecturer, He walked in at that. And he nearly gave up. He was 38 years of age before he got a job. How's that, people? We've got our value system for science and scientists in this country and everywhere else wrong. We've got to value our science. We've got to value our people who can think and do that. I'm going to give you one other example because I've got a captive audience and I can. I was director here and I was very proudly taking the board of the NRF on their first visit to SAIAB. We had our board meeting, etc. And then I said, oh, now I'm going to show you SAIAB. And at that time, the collection was downstairs. And this was a sick building. Wendy Sweetman, my finance minister, yes. Finance people are always ministers. Came to me one day and said, Paul, I can't come in here. Every time I walk in that door, I'm feeling, it was a sick building. Anyway, I was beginning to note this thing and saying, why was it a sick building? Why my staff not suffering? Anyway, so the board had a meeting and I took them proudly through. One of the board members was a guy called Dr. John Job. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of John Job. John Job was the MD of SAPI South Africa. At that time, SAPI was one of the biggest companies in the world. Okay. And I took him through the collection room and we walked up those stairs and he pulled me back and said, Paul, I just want to have a word with you. He says, that collection, you espoused all its virtues. I'm going to tell you now, by the next board meeting, I want a plan for you to evacuate that collection. He said it's breaking every rule of occupational health and safety in this country. And we in the NRF cannot do that. That is why you've got a lovely building. Because a geologist in charge of a thing. And afterwards I was speaking to John and I said, John, that was amazing when we built this. And I pulled him aside and said, thanks, John. You know where it came from and all that. And I said, what are you doing in charge of wood and forestry? He said, Paul, a PhD is a ticket to thinking. It's a training of the mind to do and solve problems. And he says the best PhD, the best MDs that he's come across out there are PhD graduates. I'm a geologist, but I can run an international company because I might train my mind. And all I can say in return to that there might not be those science jobs, but we are doing this country a massive favor by producing people who can think, people who can make decisions, hard decisions sometimes, and do it on the basis of rationality. And so our efforts are not in vain. That's what I'm saying. Even though they don't end up in ichthyology, you're training good people to solve problems in this country. And just hope that there are guys as nutty as Skelton, who's passionate about fishes and not forests, to carry on with those sort of things. If you get one or two passionate people whose dream is to be an ichthyologist, and let me tell you, people like Phil Hamstra, Eric Anderson, those people are in that mold. They didn't care what you did. Phil retired and he worked for the rest of his life as though he had not retired for a moment. Passionate about it. That's the type of person you want in science, whether it be birds or anything else. If you don't get that, don't go there. They don't do that. They should be MDs or directors of government departments and things like that. Sorry, people, I'm lecturing.
Okay, I think we must move to the online and give the online people a chance. Like here, how do we access it?
Oh. Okay, I need an interpreter.
How far north?
In
Paul, is it?
Zambia, yeah. Okay.
Where does it cut off?
Albert, you better help me. Nirenda. Thank you for that. That's a fantastic comment. And yes, I agree with you. We really need more books like this in Africa. This is just, the sub region, Southern African region. We want one for Central Africa, East Africa. We've got them for West Africa, but they're scientific. We need them in to communicate with the public as well. Oh, what were some of the biggest challenges? My directors were the biggest challenges. No, people. The world has got more and more complex. And I think dealing with that complexity when you're trying to do science, so bureaucracy gets in the way. You cannot now walk out of here and collect a fish like I did in the 70s. In the 70s, I said, I'm going out tomorrow. We're going down to Early Farm till I collect some fish. No problem. Today, it takes you a year to get the permit to maybe get there. Never mind get the vehicle out the vehicle pool in SAIAB. So, and that's the reality of it. It's a very complex world, necessarily so by the number of people and so forth. You know that, don't you? And yeah. All right. So that's one of those challenges, was always to do right in a world where right is not always the easiest way to do it. What will you miss most after retirement? I don't miss it one bit. I've been retired for 12 years. I'm having the time of my life. So I don't know if that answers that question, but I think as long as you're capable, as long as you're physically and mentally around and you're in a position to do so and you're passionate, then follow your passion, because that's the best way to retire. Because when you retire, every day is a Sunday. No, and I, personally, that's personally, I found my retirement to be a rich with, and the product you see in front of you is evidence of that. Hard work, yes, that never, besides, but good partnerships and so forth, and good friends, good colleagues have always been there. But when you retire, you don't have to fade away. You can remain relevant. And I've seen some people become even more relevant in retirement. Matebo. Wow, thank you for the country producing critical thinkers. I'm nearly past my sell-by date. But I hope they are. I certainly hope. And all I can say is critical thinking is a really rare factor out there. And the more PhDs we can produce, but with discipline and with rectitude. In other words, no easy route there, boy. You do the hard work, then we do that. Trout, good or bad? Oh, you must eat some trout. They're the highest on the menu. They're terrific to eat. They're really good. No, all right, seriously. Aliens are a fact of life. Whether we like it or not, they were introduced before our time. They've been put in there. All I call for is rationality. Is not one side takes all. It's a meeting of the minds. And if we can meet the minds and come to realize that the treasure of our indigenous fishes and the story they tell, I haven't told you those stories, people, but some of our fish have been here since Gondwanaland. That's 100 million years ago. Others, 60 million years ago. They are treasures of this nation that tell the story of this land. They are ours. You cannot pass those away in a generation for the fact of a few anglers demanding every bit of fresh water that they want. It's got to be a meeting of the minds. Good or bad, I think they're fantastic, because many trout anglers are also well educated in aquatic way. They fight for the health of the world, of the systems and so forth. There's a good side to that, but it has to be a give and take, not a take it all. And unfortunately, some are take it all and not give and take. That's all I appeal to.
Yes.
Louis was a student of mine. Oh no, wait, Sean's there.
No, sure.
Oh no, he also. So Louis da Costa. So Louis spent quite a few years here in SAIAB, and he's in Europe, in Belgium today. Yeah, Louis, I miss you too. I'm coming to get you one of these days. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, we've all had a taste of the book. Now's the time to buy it.
Yeah. All right. You better switch that mic off at this stage. Can you do that? And there are reasons for that.